The New York Times has run an ad for Antifa, a full-page ad for what Homeland Security is calling acts of domestic terrorism. You know, right now, Facebook and Google and a couple of the big tech giants are in trouble because they accepted money from Russian actors during the presidential election of 2016. Russian actors played on both sides in an effort to start chaos, literally. And now we have the New York Times running an ad for a group that openly calls for the overthrow of a sitting U.S. president, of an elected U.S. president. What does that mean? TheNewAmerican.com may have our answer. This nightmare must end, declares the opening lines of a full-page advertisement in the New York Times promoting mayhem and insurrection for this Saturday, November 4th. November 4th it begins, the ad continues. Join with the thousands who will gather in cities and towns across the country. A movement of protests that continue every day and night, growing until we become millions, determined now to stop until this regime is driven from power. What could that possibly mean? The advertisement directs readers to go to refusefascism.org to find a protest near you. At the website, information on planned November 4th protests can be found for Boston, Chicago, Atlanta, Cincinnati, Austin, Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles, New York City, Omaha, and many other cities. The New York Times, of course, knows, even if many of its readers do not, that Refuse Fascism is a front group founded and run by the Revolutionary Communist Party, RCP, a violent Marxist-Leninist group that idolizes China's communist mass murderer Mao Zedong, which makes the Refuse Fascism appeal to, quote, humanity doubly ludicrous and doubly offensive. No, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept the fascist America, the ad declares. Now, of course, here is the full page ad. This nightmare must end, it reads. The Trump-Pence regime must go. November 4th it begins. Be there. Join with the thousands who will gather in cities and towns across the country. To find a protest near you, of course, go to refusefascism.org. This is the actual ad in the New York Times paper. The full page ad. We extend a welcome invitation to all to join us in this great cause. How much money do you think it costs to put that ad into the papers? Better yet, how many paid protesters are going to be on the scene to cause violence? The New American continues. In the name of humanity, the Revolutionary Communist Party Refuse Fascism fanatics still believe that Mao was fully justified in murdering tens of millions of Chinese and torturing, imprisoning, and enslaving hundreds of millions more. The RCP Refuse Fascism cadres form a major component of the masked, black-clad Antifa thugs who have been rioting and causing mayhem throughout America for the past year. The New American's Mitchell Shaw reported on September 30th about the upcoming November 4th protests planned by Antifa/RCP communists. We have already seen these protests and the death, destruction, and turmoil they have left in their wakes. Why is the New York Times helping a known communist group, one with both a long history of violence as well as recent involvement in riots, sedition, and other criminal acts, promote havoc and overthrow a validly elected president of the United States? Now, for those of you who have done research into Antifa, you may know that this organization doesn't come out of nowhere. It's a very old organization, about 100 years old. We'll get into that in just a minute here. It's no secret that the New York Times has been pro-communist for over a century. From covering up Stalin's genocide of millions of Ukrainians to helping make Fidel Castro the dictator of Cuba, to glorifying Mao Zedong, to romanticizing communist weather underground terrorist Bill Ayers, and much, much more. The Times has been foremost among media organizations promoting communism worldwide. In fact, this year, in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Times has run an appalling series of articles under the heading Red Century that wistfully pine for the romantic era of the Gulag. This is not the first time that the Times has aided the RCP/Refuse Fascism communists by running an ad for their subversive operations. As we reported in January, the Times ran a similar full-page ad for the RCP/Refuse Fascism to gin up support for the mayhem that was unleashed on President Donald Trump's inauguration. At what point is that not inciting violence? If something happens on November, if something happens on November 4th. The New York Times promoted this, pushed this. But just how old is Antifa? How long have they been doing this dance? Antifa is a communist front. The flag on the right, the logo on the right, is of course what we see today, anti-fascist action with two flags, correct? This is the German logo from the early 1920s and 1930s. In fact, here's a Wikipedia page on it. The first German movement to call itself Antifa, anti-fascist action, was proclaimed by the German Communist Party in their newspaper in 1932. And it held its first rally in Berlin on the 10th of July 1932. And of course, this will go on to say how, the Social Democrats and the liberals were all, of course, against Nazism. But if one actually does research into Nazi Germany and, of course, socialism, they're the same thing. Hitler, of course, set up a de facto government of sorts and established price controls. In fact, Dr. Joseph Goebbels stated that Lenin and Hitler were not very different. In addition to that, Stalin and Hitler had a pact to take out the supposedly fascist Poland. This is really interesting because they created propaganda to label Poland as a fascist regime to justify an invasion. We are seeing the same rhetoric played out over and over again. And it's incredible that the New York Times, the prestigious New York Times, running an ad, a full-page ad, to what Homeland Security calls a terrorist organization. Will November 4th be a big day? Michael Snyder may have our answer. On November 4th, the Antifa insurgency against Donald Trump and his supporters will begin. Are we about to see chaos in the streets in major cities all over America? Antifa and other radical leftist groups are promising that a series of protests will begin on November 4th that will never end until the Trump-Pence regime is removed from power. And as you will see below, Antifa has openly and publicly embraced violence, and the Department of Homeland Security says that they have engaged in domestic terrorism. Hopefully these protests will fizzle out after a few weeks. He says weeks, I'm saying days or hours. Because political organizations that believe in the necessary use of violence have no place in our society. Martin Luther King Jr. said something absolutely fascinating. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was quoted as saying, "The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence you may murder the hater, but you do not murder the hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate, so it goes. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." Antifa is actively inciting violence to get their way. Amazingly, there are still some out there that are claiming that the radical left is not planning anything for November 4th. The following comes directly from refusefascism.org, which is one of the key websites for Antifa and other radical leftist groups. On November 4th, 2017, we will gather in the streets and public squares of cities and towns across this country. At first, many thousands declaring that this whole regime is illegitimate and that we will not stop until our single demand is met. Their demand is, this nightmare must end, the Trump-Pence regime must go. Our protest must grow day after day and night after night, thousands becoming hundreds of thousands and then millions, determined to act, to put a stop to the grave danger that the Trump-Pence regime poses to the world by demanding that this whole regime be removed from power. Our actions will reflect the values of respect for all of humanity. Unless you disagree with them, of course, because if you disagree with them, folks, you're about to get the violence that they're talking about. And the world we want, in stark contrast to the hate and bigotry of the Trump-Pence fascist regime. Our determination to persist and not back down will compel the whole world to take note. When I was looking into Antifa, I don't know if you have it all or not, there were several videos promoting terrorism while they were holding or toting rocket launchers, hanging out with Hezbollah, ISIS, and so on and so forth, or their types, terrorist organizations. And the New York Times has run an ad for that. Just go to Google and type that in. I guarantee you'll see the video, or a video, because there's several. Our determination to persist and not back down will compel the whole world to take note. Every force and faction in the power structure would be forced to respond to our demand. The cracks and divisions among the powers already evident today will sharpen and widen. As we draw more and more people forward to stand up, all of this could lead to a situation where this illegitimate regime is removed from power. It's not illegitimate. Trump was elected legally. That sounds pretty serious to me, says Michael Snyder. Hopefully, they are not able to back up their words with actions. I've seen various lists of cities where Antifa protests are planned floating around the internet, but I felt that it was important to go right to the source. According to refusefascism.org, this is the official list of cities where activists will be gathering on November 4th. Austin, Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Honolulu, Indianapolis, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, New York City, Philadelphia, Pittsfield, Portland, Salem, San Francisco, Seattle, and Tucson. Let us hope that none of these events become violent. But we have seen violence from Antifa on numerous occasions since the election. And this is an organization that says the use of force is intrinsic to their political philosophy, just like Marx did, Karl Marx. The following comes from a startling article in The Hill. Anti-fascist activists, or Antifa, increasingly mobilized in the wake of President Trump's election, are unapologetic about what they describe as the necessary use of violence to combat authoritarianism. While both experts on the movement and activists within it emphasize that not everyone who participates in anti-fascist activism engages in violence, they say the use of force is intrinsic to their political philosophy. Needless to say, The Hill is not exactly a conservative publication. At this point, everyone knows what Antifa is all about. And my hope is that Republicans and Democrats will stand united in denouncing their violent tactics. For example, just consider what happened in recent weeks at a recent event in Minnesota. Hundreds of masked protesters at the University of Minnesota recently conducted a violent protest against a speech by conservative activist and YouTube commentator Lauren Southern. Fights erupted outside the event, forcing police to intervene. Members of the conservative group Collegians for a Constructive Tomorrow, CFACT, which hosted the event, say they were tagged and set upon by masked Antifa activists who spat on them, hit them, shoved them off bicycles, and maced them. These crazed lunatics actually believe that Donald Trump is a modern-day version of Adolf Hitler, and therefore they believe that the use of violence is justified in order to prevent a new Nazi regime from taking over America. Of course, that is complete and utter nonsense. And in their zeal to attack conservatives, Antifa is actually becoming what they say they hate. If anyone can be characterized as brown shirts, it is the Antifa thugs who are willing to use violence against those that would dare to disagree with their radical leftist agenda. According to Politico, their increasingly violent tactics have caused the Department of Homeland Security to officially classify their activities as domestic terrorist violence. Federal authorities have been warning state and local officials since early 2016 that leftist extremists, known as Antifa, had become increasingly confrontational and dangerous, so much so that the Department of Homeland Security formally classified their activities as domestic terrorist violence, according to interviews and confidential law enforcement documents obtained by Politico nonetheless. The leftist outlet, Politico. Are you starting to understand how dangerous these guys are? So we have Politico openly exposing Antifa, yet the New York Times, which is supposed to be quite centered, of course we all know it's not, running a full-page ad for them. Now, of course, I don't know if Politico's supported them or whatever have you, but still. And there is actually evidence that radical leftists have been cultivating ties with Islamic terrorists in the Middle East. This is what I just mentioned to you. The following comes from a report that was published by the Daily Mail. A secret FBI investigation of the violent resistant movement on college campuses against President Trump has led to an alarming discovery: the collusion between American anarchists and foreign terrorists in the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, according to a confidential informational report by the FBI field offices. There is clearly overwhelming evidence that there are growing ties between U.S. radicals and the Islamic State, as well as several ISIS offshoots and splinter groups, stated the FBI field report, which was delivered to Acting Director Andrew McCabe on July 11, 2017, and which is being published for the first time in my new book, All Out War: The Plot to Destroy Trump. An atmosphere of violence and fear creates an environment in which many conservatives are afraid to speak out. In fact, a survey that was just released discovered that 58% of Americans believe the political climate prevents them from sharing their own political beliefs. But this is not what our founders intended. Freedom of speech is in the Bill of Rights for a reason, because without it we would be in a world of trouble. As the radical left becomes more violent, we need to become bolder than ever. And of course what he means by that is, don't let them silence you. He's not inciting violence at all. But of course, that was probably hate speech, according to Antifa, even though they're running an ad in the New York Times to incite violence. The question still remains, though. Will November 4th be a big day? Only time will tell. Let me know what you think. God bless and carry on.